The Johnson family home stood on the outskirts of a small town in Georgia, surrounded by shade trees whose branches seemed to shield it from the outside world. The family had lived here for several years. Evelyn Johnson, her husband Mark, and their daughter Lauren, who had recently enrolled in community college to everyone around them. They looked like a model family, where everything went on as normal. Mark worked as a lawyer, often lost in court or behind papers, while Evelyn took care of the house and sometimes participated in social events, attracting attention with her charm and impeccable appearance. Lauren was a quiet and sensible girl, with big brown eyes and an easy smile. At 19, she was already independent, but she retained a childlike affection for her mother. Their bond had always been strong, and Lauren loved spending time with Evelyn, shopping or discussing new ideas for home projects. But lately, their relationship had begun to change. Lauren brought a new friend into the house. His name was Eric. He went to college with her, and it seemed like a romance was brewing between them. Evelyn noticed Eric right away. He was a handsome young man with high cheekbones, expressive eyes, and an easy, almost careless manner that made him the center of attention. It was hard not to notice his attraction. It wasn't just Lauren who felt it. Evelyn felt a strange tension in her chest for the first time when they met gazes at the dinner table, where he sat across from her. The young man's easy smile and confident demeanor gave her a strange feeling. She couldn't say exactly what it was, but even then she felt threatened by her familiar world. Initially, Evelyn tried to disengage herself from her thoughts. She realized that such thoughts were inappropriate. Eric was just a boy, her daughter's friend. But every time he stopped by their home, she noticed that she involuntarily caught his gaze. Eric seemed to sense this invisible connection, and it only fueled the fire that Evelyn couldn't put out inside her. They exchanged glances, and there was something more than innocent interest in those glances. A few weeks passed. Lauren spent a lot of time with Eric, which is only natural for young people who are just beginning their romantic relationship. However, Evelyn began to notice that her own feelings for the young man were becoming more and more apparent. One day, when Lauren and Eric were in her daughter's room, she heard them laughing. It was the same laughter that was usually a sign of lightness and joy. But for Evelyn, it was an agonizing reminder of her own desire that she couldn't get rid of. One night when Mark was late at work, Lauren had gone out with friends to a movie, and Eric had stayed at their house, saying he would wait for her return. Evelyn found herself alone with the young man. This evening was the first time the two of them had been alone together for such a long period of time, and it, unnoticed by both of them, was the catalyst for further events. Eric was sitting in the living room, leafing through a magazine, when Evelyn, trying to keep her cool, offered him something to drink. She took a bottle of wine from the shelf and poured 2 glasses. Eric gratefully accepted it and toasted to good company. They sat across from each other on the couch, and the tension in the air was becoming palpable. The wine relaxed Evelyn, and she noticed her tongue becoming more relaxed. Conversations flowed smoothly. They touched on trivia, discussing music, traveling, and then on personal things. Evelyn learned that Eric's parents had recently divorced, which gave him a kind of freedom he hadn't had before. His sincerity and openness touched something deep within her. She felt for the first time that he understood her in a way that Mark didn't. There was a kind of intimacy between them that had previously been unacceptable. Eric listened to her with interest, catching every word. He no longer seemed to be just Lauren's friend, but something more. Their conversation turned into long stares, and at one point Evelyn noticed his hand casually touching her arm. The gesture was insignificant, but it stirred a storm of emotion in her. She stood up abruptly, as if she had suddenly remembered something, and went to the kitchen to put the glasses away. Her hands trembled as she tried to cope with the feelings overwhelming her. Nothing happened that night. Eric left soon after, leaving Evelyn in complete confusion. However, this was only the starting point for their future encounters. Now they looked at each other with understanding. Secret glances, casual touches, and increasingly relaxed conversations became part of their little ritual. Evelyn knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop. Every day her attraction to Eric grew stronger. One day, Lauren, busy with her studies, stayed late at college for extra classes, and Eric came to the house alone, as was the custom. Evelyn waited for him with a feeling that could hardly be called mere excitement. She realized that their meeting might go beyond friendship, but she wasn't ready to resist. When Eric entered the house, their gazes met with such tension that the silence between them seemed more expressive than any words. He stepped closer, and Evelyn could hold back no longer. At that moment, they both stepped over the line. Their first kiss was brief, almost elusive, but it was followed by another. And then they couldn't stop, realizing that each next step was taking them further and further away from the norms they were supposed to uphold. Evelyn secretly knew this was the beginning of something dark and dangerous. But each time they were alone together, the feeling only grew stronger. She began to catch herself waiting for these moments, short but excruciatingly sweet. Evelyn began to feel alive in the moment, as if she had found something she had been missing all these years. But the more she immersed herself in this affair, the less strength she had left to hide her secret. Several weeks had passed since the night Evelyn and Eric had first kissed. Their secret meetings became more frequent and more daring. It was as if they were playing with fire, on the verge of being exposed, but each time the temptation grew stronger and the bond deeper. Evelyn's feelings mixed into a strange cocktail. She felt fear and pleasure at the same time. She knew this was wrong. Every time Mark came home from work, she felt guilty, but her attraction to Eric outweighed any moral doubts. The whole world seemed to disappear when it was just the two of them. Those secret passion-filled moments were already an integral part of her life. But as soon as Evelyn began to notice her loss of vigilance, she realized that her actions were beginning to arouse suspicion. Lauren, who used to spend a lot of time with Eric, was now staying late at college more and more often. Although she showed her mother no signs of jealousy or resentment, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter was feeling something. The situation was made worse by the fact that Eric, despite his youth, was beginning to show a growing assertiveness in their relationship. He no longer felt like hiding. There was no longer the same fear of exposure in his eyes. He was clearly enjoying being more than just a family friend. Every encounter they had only fueled his confidence that they could continue this indefinitely. Evelyn tried to keep their relationship under control, but realized she was losing that control. She became nervous and irritable, trying not to attract the attention of her husband or daughter, but it was becoming more and more difficult every day, especially when she realized she was starting to feel jealous of Eric and Lauren. Despite their connection, Eric was still her boyfriend, and seeing them together made Evelyn feel a mixture of jealousy and hurt, though she was well aware of the ridiculousness of those feelings. Meanwhile, Lauren noticed a change in Eric's behavior. He became distant, as if his thoughts were far away. They still met, went to the movies, sat in cafes with friends, but the ease they had before was gone. Lauren tried to ignore it, blaming it on his classes or fatigue. She couldn't imagine that the reason for his behavior lay much deeper. One such evening, when she and Eric went out to meet friends again, Lauren decided to have a frank talk with him. They were sitting in the company of his best friends, Sam and Dave, behind the bar of a small cafe where they often met after class. Sam and Dave had been good buddies of Eric's since the beginning of college. The two of them often became his support during difficult moments, and their presence eased a little of the tension Lauren felt. "Eric," Lauren began as her friends stepped away for another round of drinks. "You've changed somehow. What's going on?" Eric, preoccupied with his own thoughts, looked at her in surprise. "Me? Changed?" he asked, trying to hide his inner tension. "What do you mean?" Lauren frowned, her eyes expressing genuine concern. "It's like you've distanced yourself from me. We rarely talk like we used to. I sense something is going on, but you don't want to talk about it." Eric sighed, not knowing what to answer. Lauren was right, but he couldn't admit to her that there was more going on between him and her mother than just a friendly relationship. He paused, considering how to allay her suspicions. "I'm sorry, Lauren," he finally said, lowering his gaze. "I'm just tired. School, work. You know, I need a little time to myself sometimes." She nodded, but his words didn't reassure her. Something inside her told her that it was only part of the truth. But Lauren decided not to push it just yet. She loved Eric, and didn't want to ruin their relationship just because of her insecurities. Meanwhile, Family friends who knew Evelyn began to notice her changes as well. One such friend was Kathy, their neighbor and a close pal of Evelyn's. They often spent time together discussing the latest news, going for walks, and organizing local events. Over the past few months, however, Kathy had increasingly noticed that her friend had become withdrawn and secretive. One day when Kathy came to visit Evelyn to discuss another project for a charity fair, she noticed Evelyn absent-mindedly answering her questions as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. They were sitting in the living room when Kathy finally decided to ask the question that had been bothering her for a long time. "Evelyn, is something wrong? You haven't been the same lately. I've known you for years and I can tell when something is wrong." Evelyn froze. She hadn't expected her friend to notice such little things. Taking a deep breath, she tried to hide her excitement, but it was difficult. "It's okay, Katie, it's just a lot to take care of," she replied, trying to smile. "Mark's always at work, Lauren's growing up, that's about it." But Katie wasn't so easily fooled. She knew there was more behind that mask. "Are you sure?" Katie asked, looking at her intently. "If something is going on, you can always talk to me." Evelyn hurried to change the subject, not wanting to go further into the conversation. But she realized that her secret meetings with Eric wouldn't stay hidden forever. Lauren might suspect something, and friends and neighbors would start asking questions. And with each passing day, that threat of exposure became more real. Soon after that evening, Lauren began to notice not only a change in Eric, but also in her mother. Evelyn was no longer the open and cheerful woman she had known her to be. She often secluded herself in her room, spending time in thought, as if trying to escape from reality. Lauren couldn't understand what exactly was going on, but she sensed that something had changed in their family. One day, when Lauren got home earlier than expected, she found Eric and Evelyn in the living room. They were sitting across from each other and talking, but there was something in their gazes that gave Lauren a strange feeling. She immediately sensed the tension in the air, but didn't pay it any mind, deciding that her suspicions were unfounded. Later, however, as she lay in her room, she began to remember those moments when Eric and her mother were near each other. Lauren realized that ever since Eric had come into their lives, it was as if her mother had changed. She had become more nervous, aloof, and often evaded questions. Something about these changes seemed wrong to Lauren, but she couldn't quite put the puzzle together. It had been several days since Lauren had begun to notice changes in Eric's and her mother's behavior. The suspicions that had been brewing in her mind grew every day. She couldn't shake off the disturbing thoughts that something was going on between them. At first, Lauren tried to calm herself down, blaming it on her own insecurities and fear of losing Eric. But as their relationship became increasingly cold and distant, she realized it wasn't just her. Eric was changing too. His attention, which had once been directed at Lauren, was now scattered. He was looking more and more at her mother, and Lauren couldn't help but notice it. Although she tried to hide her doubts, the inner tension was building. She could no longer stay away. One evening, when Lauren got home after a long day of classes, she found Eric and her mother alone in the kitchen. They were sitting at the table, and their conversation seemed too confident for casual friends. Eric leaned closer to Evelyn, and she responded with a kind of elusive warmth that Lauren had never noticed before. "Hi, Mom," Lauren said coldly as she entered the room. Eric quickly backed away from Evelyn as if caught in the act. Lauren saw the tension slip across his face, but he immediately put on a mask of nonchalance. "Hi," Eric mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Evelyn seemed to sense something wrong, too. Her smile became strained, and she hurried to change the subject, offering Lauren something to eat. But Lauren knew there was something more behind that attempt. She felt it like a sharp knife stabbing into her heart. Since that evening, Lauren's relationship with her mother had become even more strained. Evelyn tried to act normal, but Lauren could see that she was nervous. Eric, as if trying to make amends, began to spend more time with Lauren, pretending that nothing had changed. Lauren wasn't blind, however. She saw his gaze return to her mother again and again as they exchanged strange, secret gestures. Her suspicions soon grew into an obsession. She began to follow them. Lauren watched their every move, caught every glance, every touch. Her world was cracking at the seams, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. One day, left alone at home, Lauren decided to go to her mother's room. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she needed to find proof that her suspicions were valid. Her heart pounded in her chest as she cautiously opened Evelyn's bedroom door. Her mother's room had always been a model of order and style. On the bedside table were pictures of the family, Mark, Lauren, and Evelyn herself, smiling in each one. But Lauren saw something fake in those pictures. She moved closer to the nightstand and, not knowing why, began to examine it. Opening the top drawer, she found something that sent a shock through her. It was a letter, a note written in Eric's hand. "Evelyn, I can't stop thinking about you. You're like air to me. I hope no one finds out our secret. I look forward to seeing you." Lauren's hands trembled as she read those lines. Her head spun. The letter fell to the floor, but she continued to stand in complete silence, realizing that her worst suspicions were true. Her mother and her boyfriend were linked by an affair. Lauren's world shattered in an instant. Lauren couldn't contain her emotions anymore. She didn't know what to do, how to deal with this betrayal. Her rage, frustration, and pain raged inside her. She couldn't talk about it to anyone. All her thoughts were centered on one thing. How could her mother do this to her? How could Eric betray her trust? Lauren began to avoid talking to them. Her alienation was evident, but Evelyn and Eric didn't seem to notice that she knew about their secret. Meanwhile, Eric and Evelyn became increasingly careless. Their meetings became more frequent, and they no longer tried to hide their feelings so carefully. Passion seemed to cloud their minds, robbing them of the ability to think clearly. Evelyn often caught herself thinking that their affair could not remain a secret forever, but her dependence on these meetings was so strong that she continued to move forward as if blinded by her feelings. One evening, when Mark was late at work again, Evelyn decided to invite Eric over to her house. She knew Lauren would be home late, so she decided to take advantage of that time. Eric, of course, agreed, and soon they were alone together. They sat in the kitchen as they once had, but now their relationship was much deeper. Evelyn could feel her heart beating faster every time Eric leaned over to whisper something in her ear. However, their recklessness had peaked. They were no longer thinking about the consequences, nor were they afraid that someone might catch them. At this time, Lauren came home earlier than expected. She heard muffled voices in the kitchen and decided to quietly move closer. When she peeked through the crack of the door, she saw something that finally broke her. Eric and her mother were sitting too close, their hands touching. Lauren felt her heart being torn apart. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was reality. Her reality. The anger that had built up inside her was boiling up, ready to burst out. Lauren slowly backed away from the door, her breathing becoming rapid. She couldn't take it anymore. Something inside her had broken, and she could no longer think clearly. The silence that had enveloped the Johnson home after the murder seemed ominous. Evelyn lay on the bed in the bedroom, her body lifeless and cold. A strange, eerie calm now emanated from the white sheets neatly draped over the bed. But what stood out most was the dark pool of blood spread around her head. Evelyn had been murdered with a brutality that left no doubt of the perpetrator's rage. The wound on her head clearly indicated that the murder had been the result of a brutal, blunt force trauma. The room was surprisingly neat for a crime scene. Things were still in their places, no broken objects or overturned furniture, which made it all the more frightening. Only on the floor lay a toppled lamp with a broken shade, as if it had been dropped during the struggle. There were no signs of desperate resistance around, suggesting that Evelyn trusted her killer. The blow to her head had been sudden, and death had caught up with her almost instantly. The setting itself seemed emphatically calm, which only added to the sense of tragedy. When the detectives arrived on the scene, they knew immediately that this was not going to be an easy case. Junior Detective Jason Hill, a newcomer to the homicide squad, could barely hide his excitement. This was his first major investigation, and the scene before him caused him a mixture of fear and excitement. Senior Detective Simon West, on the other hand, maintained a cold calm. He had been dealing with cases like this for years, and his experience allowed him to remain judicious even in the most confusing of situations. Simon scrutinized the room, making notes in his notebook. His sharp gray eyes studied every corner, every object, as if he were looking for something that might point to the culprit. The crime scene didn't look ordinary. No attempted theft, no signs of violence other than a blow to the head. This meant that the killer was familiar with the victim and had no intentions of robbery. At first glance, everything seemed to point to a personal motive. "What do you think?" Jason asked, noticing that Simon was taking too long at the door. "It's a murder of passion," Simon answered calmly, not looking up. "It's too clean." The killer knew how to act, and he did it quickly. "Maybe the husband? Or someone she knew?" Jason suggested, looking at the pictures on the nightstand. One of them showed a happy family, Evelyn, her husband Mark, and their daughter Lauren. Simon nodded, looking at the picture. "We should talk to them," he agreed. "But there's something else, on the wall, see?" A slight crack as if someone had thrown something heavy. Jason moved closer and saw a thin line that ran along the wall near the bed. It was a barely noticeable detail, but Simon never missed a detail. There had been a blow here. Maybe that's what was the murder weapon. We should check for trace evidence. The detectives started their canvass. First up was the husband, Mark. He was sitting in the living room. His face had an expression of emptiness. He was holding his head in his hands. The man looked devastated, his eyes red with tears and fatigue. "When was the last time you saw your wife?" Simon asked, trying not to be too harsh. Mark sighed, lifting his head. "I was at work late, got home around 11. Lauren was already asleep, and Evelyn," his voice shook. "I went into the bedroom and found her. She was already dead." Simon nodded thoughtfully. "You didn't hear anything suspicious? Noises? Screams, maybe?" "No, nothing," Mark answered. "Everything was quiet. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw her." The detective made a note, but something in Mark's story alarmed him. His demeanor seemed too cold, even in the face of tragedy. There was an emptiness in the man's eyes, but not the despair typical of someone who loses a loved one. Lauren was next. She looked shaken, but her demeanor seemed strange. The girl was silent, her eyes swollen with tears, but she barely spoke a word when asked about the events of that night. "Lauren, where were you when it happened?" Simon asked. "I was asleep in my room." Her voice was quiet and barely audible. "I didn't hear anything. When my father came in, I only woke up then." Her answer was short, as if she was afraid to say too much. Simon noticed the way she avoided meeting his gaze, but he didn't think much of it. After all, tragedy could break even the strongest person. "Did it seem to you that something had changed in the house in recent weeks?" The detective asked the next question, watching her reaction carefully. Lauren froze for a moment. She looked up at him, her gaze blank. "No," she replied after a pause. "It was business as usual." But Simon noticed that her answer sounded too fast, as if she were trying to hide something important. At this stage, however, the detectives had no good reason to suspect her. So far, it looked as if Lauren was simply an unwitting victim of a terrible event. Meanwhile, the detectives continued to look for clues. One of them, a letter Lauren found in her mother's room, was the first clue to the false trail. They discovered it by accident, and the contents of the note made them wonder. "Evelyn, I can't stop thinking about you. You are like air to me. I hope no one finds out our secret." "Someone has been writing love notes to your wife," Simon said coldly, showing the letter to Mark. He turned pale and his hands began to tremble. "I didn't know," he whispered, staring at the note with a horrified expression. "I didn't know she had someone." This discovery sent the investigation down a new path. The detectives began to consider the possibility that Evelyn was leading a double life and had a lover. Simon wondered who this mystery man was, and whether he could have been involved in her death. However, the note did not mention a name, which only made the search more difficult. Detectives began looking at Evelyn's immediate social circle, including family friends and acquaintances. They interviewed neighbors and friends, but none of them knew about her affair. All they had was an anonymous letter and a few guesses. A few days into the investigation, the department had a new theory. Evelyn's lover might have been younger than she was. It was unlikely, but the detectives decided to check out everyone the family knew, including those who socialized with Lauren and her friends. The focus of their attention was Eric, Lauren's boyfriend, who was a frequent visitor to the house. He clearly spent a lot of time with Evelyn and could possibly be her lover. When the detectives brought Eric in for questioning, his nervous demeanor made them suspicious. He denied that anything had happened between him and Evelyn, but his words sounded unconvincing. He looked scared, but not so scared that he could be immediately blamed. Simon sensed that Eric was hiding something, but there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. Several days had passed since the murder of Evelyn Johnson, and the investigation was still at a standstill. Detectives Simon West and Jason Hill continued to build leads, but there wasn't enough evidence to make a concrete accusation. The main suspicions fell on Eric, Lauren's boyfriend, who could be involved in a secret relationship with Evelyn. However, this version, strangely enough, did not provide clear evidence either. It seemed that the killer's true motive and identity were out of reach. Detective Simon felt this acutely. He knew that something was escaping their attention, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Every time they'd conducted interviews, Lauren, Mark, and Eric had looked convincing enough. None of them admitted to anything suspicious, but something was wrong. Lauren looked too detached, Mark looked devastated, and Eric looked scared. It all made for a strange picture that didn't seem to add up to a coherent whole. One day, on his way back to the crime scene, Simon decided to take another look around the house. He walked through the rooms, scrutinizing every corner, every object. Something was bothering him in the bedroom where Evelyn had been found. He had looked around the room too quickly the last time, and now he decided to take more time to look at the details. The room looked neat, except that the lamp had been knocked over and the bed was drenched in blood. Everything pointed to a sudden attack, but something was keeping Simon on edge. He walked along the bed, looking closely at the shelves of photos and Evelyn's personal belongings. On one of the shelves was a pair of women's shoes. An unusual detail caught his eye. The shoes were stacked unevenly, which seemed odd for a woman who always kept things in order. Simon slowly bent down to examine the shoes closer. He noticed faint stains on the heels of the shoes, as if someone had stepped in blood, but then quickly tried to wipe away the marks. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary stain, but to Simon it was a clue. Someone had tried to hide their presence in the room after the murder. He wondered, who would be nervous enough not to notice this mark? Glancing around the room once more, Simon began to put the details together. Meanwhile, the detectives brought Eric back in for questioning. His testimony remained confusing, but didn't provide enough evidence to incriminate him. He continued to insist that he had no relationship with Evelyn, even though the letter found in her room clearly indicated otherwise. "I never meant for this to happen," he said in one of the interviews, his head down. "But I swear I didn't kill her." Jason, the young detective, watched him closely. Eric's words sounded sincere but still didn't explain the whole picture. If he wasn't the killer, then who was? Jason glanced at Simon, who was absorbed in his own thoughts. When Eric left, Simon decided to return to Lauren. Her behavior had raised doubts in his mind from the beginning. She was too silent and closed off, as if she were hiding something. But every time she was asked about the night of the murder, she answered predictably, and without obvious gaps. It seemed as if her words were premeditated. Simon invited Lauren in for another interrogation. The girl sat in front of him, her face impassive, as if she was already tired of all this talk. But Simon knew something had changed. He had a plan. "Lauren," he began, leaning back in his chair, "we know there was more than just friendship between Eric and your mother. But I want to hear your side of the story. Did you know that?" Lauren nervously clenched her hands in her lap. Her face remained calm, but her eyes expressed concern. "No, I didn't know," she answered, trying to sound convincing. "If I had known, I would have stopped it. But I didn't know," she repeated, as if she were convincing herself as well as the detective. Simon watched her reaction, trying to pick up on the slightest change in her behavior. He knew she was lying, but he wanted to make her make a mistake. "How do you explain this?" he asked, showing her a picture of shoes with bloodstains on the heels. "Are these your shoes, Lauren?" The girl froze. Her face contorted with fear for a moment, but she quickly got control of herself. I don't know how it happened." Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. Simon leaned closer to her, continuing to insist. "You were in the bedroom that night, Lauren. You left footprints. You stepped in your mother's blood and tried to cover it up. But you failed. You've been lying to us from the beginning. I want to know the truth. Why did you do it?" Lauren turned pale. Her hands trembled, and she lowered her gaze. It seemed to take all her strength not to burst into tears right in front of him. She took a deep breath, but she couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. I didn't mean to," she began, and her voice shook. "It wasn't me. I didn't mean to kill her. It just happened." Simon was silent, giving her time to continue. Lauren, as if breaking through a dam of emotion, spoke faster. "I found out about them. I saw them together. Eric and my mother. I couldn't bear it. I loved him. He was my boyfriend, and she took him away from me." Lauren sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wanted it to be over. I didn't know it would go this far." Simon nodded slowly, realizing that he had finally heard the truth. Lauren told him how she'd walked into her mother's bedroom that night, filled with anger and jealousy. She'd wanted to pick a fight, to vent, to make Evelyn confess her betrayal. But the argument got out of hand. In a fit of rage, Lauren grabbed a heavy object, the same table lamp, and struck her mother. The blow was hard, instantaneous. Evelyn fell, and soon blood was pouring down her face. Lauren was terrified. She realized what she had done, but it was too late. "I didn't mean to kill her," Lauren whispered, lowering her head. It just happened." Simon got up from the table and left the room, leaving Lauren alone with her feelings. She couldn't hide anymore. The motive was clear: jealousy, resentment, and betrayal. She couldn't bear the thought of her mother taking the one she loved away from her. It was this outburst of rage that led to tragedy. When Simon returned to his partner, Jason, he looked surprised. "How did you guess?" Jason asked, looking at him. "It was the little things," Simon answered, nodding toward the interrogation room. "She left too many traces. She stepped in blood, lied about her whereabouts the night of the murder. When people are hiding something, they try too hard to appear indifferent. Lauren was too calm. That's what alerted me." Jason nodded silently, realizing that Simon's experience had come into play again. The real killer had been in front of their eyes all along, but they'd been looking elsewhere. After Lauren's confession, the fates of everyone involved in this tragedy began to change rapidly. The girl was arrested, and a trial awaited her. Despite the fact that Lauren did not plan to kill her mother, the law was inexorable. The lawyer tried to build a defense on an emotional impulse, but the sentence was harsh: years in prison for manslaughter. In the courtroom, as the verdict was announced, Lauren couldn't hold back the tears. She realized that she had ruined not only her life, but the lives of everyone she cared about. Eric, upon learning the truth, was shaken to the core. He could not believe that his secret relationship with Evelyn was the cause of such a terrible tragedy. Tormented by guilt, he severed all ties with Lauren and her family, leaving college and moving out of town. He couldn't live with the burden any longer. It seemed that his entire future was ruined, and he had a long way to go to reconcile with himself. Mark, having lost his wife and destroyed his family, remained indifferent to what was happening. His pain was deep, but he never fully understood why things had happened the way they did. As he reflected on the events, he increasingly blamed himself for not noticing what was happening under his nose. His marriage was an illusion built on lies, and he had to find the meaning of life all over again. For the detectives, Simon and Jason, this case was an important lesson. In uncovering this tragedy, they became convinced once again that beneath the surface of family well-being can lie many hidden secrets and deep emotions. Simon, despite his reticence, also felt how the case affected him. He knew that the truth always comes out, no matter how ulterior the motive. All that matters is paying attention to the little things that sometimes prove decisive.